Let's just go through this, and I will preface the whole thing by saying I've tried to encapsulate 10-ish years of product management experience in healthcare into like 4 slides, which is just kind of crazy as I was going through it doing it. But since today's is a shorter format than what we typically have, given everyone's remote, I figured it'll be a good idea to just kind of like do the high level, like 20,000-foot view. And by all means, please ask questions. And even after this session today, I'm open to reach out to me on Facebook, and I'd be happy to like set up a conversation and start talking about it. Cool. So let's just dive right into it. So what is different about healthcare technologies? And my purpose of this slide is mostly to say as compared to the rest of tech, right? So when I talk about the rest of technology, it's both like mostly consumer applications, or social media applications, or even things like devices and all of that stuff. So what's really different about healthcare technology specifically? And the number one thing that comes to mind is just the level of regulations, patient privacy, compliance, and legal obligations that you have. Historically, over all my experiences in health tech, as a product manager, I have usually had about 30% to sometimes even 40% of my roadmap just dedicated to regulatory and compliance and privacy. So, if you're not yet a product manager, or you are one, 30% to 40% of your roadmap is a lot. And in the healthcare technology space, this is table stakes. You got to do this just to even compete. The second thing that's very different about healthcare technology is, now if you look at regular tech, you have your Twilios of the world, you have Square, you have Stripe, you have all these companies that have done a great job of just like openly allowing consumer applications to dip into APIs and pull data and send it here, and do all that good stuff. Whereas in healthcare technology, it's the opposite. So it's very difficult to acquire healthcare data. And a lot of it is siloed. So for example, I live here in San Francisco. UCSF down the street uses the same system as, let's say, Sutter Health, which is up in Pacific Heights. But those two systems won't talk to each other just because they belong to like different health systems. And then there's all these data privacy issues. And so everything remains siloed and no one really wants to give access to that data. So that's, it's a big restriction of building products in healthcare technology. Then the third thing, which is a lot more interesting, which was actually a revelation for me being at Instacart, which was at its core not a healthcare technology company, was that your business model and how you make money in healthcare does not depend on how many millions of daily or monthly active users you have. And the simple reason for that is when you have, especially here in the United States, when you have a healthcare system that's completely driven by insurance, and you have the payer model where payers actually reimburse a healthcare provider for their services, when health tech comes into the picture, you don't actually really, you don't drive to build a product that, let's say, your 5-year plan is, I need 100 million monthly active users, right? So that's not a thing in healthcare technology, which also means it takes away a lot of that consumer emphasis at first pass when you think about it. Top of the funnel. So when you talk about any application, you're talking about number of users who actually get access to it, how many people are going to even see it, how many people are even going to hear of it. So for example, just take product school, right? Some of you must have just Google searched, hey, I want to learn about product management. You saw an ad about product school, right? Or you had a friend who did something on product school, posted on Facebook, you saw it on social media, and now you're looking at it. So that's the top of the funnel in the rest of the world. Whereas in the healthcare system, in healthcare technology, there is no such thing. Like if I want to Google, if I search for, hey, show me my health records from Dr. Smith, I will get nothing. And so the top of your funnel of how as a user you even access any healthcare technology product, it begins at the point of care. So you have to go to a hospital, to an ambulatory clinic, to when you get your blood work done, so on and so forth, to actually even access the product. So it's a very restricted, much smaller top of the funnel than your typical consumer application. And then finally, one of the biggest aspects about healthcare technology is there's always multiple elements when it comes to who your stakeholders are. So when you're building a product in healthcare technology, you're not just building it for the patient. You're also building it for their partners, their families. You're building it for their providers. Like if you have to play in the health technology space, you have to have that provider component. Because if you go to the first bullet point, which is about regulations and compliance, no one will let you credibly play in the healthcare technology space unless you have a plug-in into health systems and providers. Because when it comes to patient safety, patient information, no one really wants to trust it unless you're affiliated with some sort of provider or health system. So that's a very unique set of, and I want to describe this slide as like, these are not just the unique elements about healthcare technology, but if you're a product manager or someone getting into product management and who looks at your typical consumer app or a social media app, these are all constraints which would, if they existed in the social media world, we would not have a Facebook, or we would not have a Twitter or Snapchat, because some of these bullet points would completely kill that business model. So that's the uniqueness about healthcare technology. And I'm going to pause here for a few seconds to see if there's any questions. And if not, I'll continue on and we can do questions in the end.
Gaurav, I guess I have a question. When you talk about health tech products, can you give us some examples so,
Yeah,
you would
totally.
understand that better?
Yeah, sure. So, and again, this is a very broad, opening slide as well as presentation. So healthcare technology, there's so many products that span right from, you could be talking about, in the instrumentation space, whether it's how you're innovating when it comes to imaging technologies or when it comes to surgical technologies. So that is one form of healthcare technology products. Another form, and towards the end of this, I actually have a slide on some emerging areas, which is a lot more interesting and consumer driven. But then now you have a lot of apps which are trying to help in healthcare technology. Like you have apps like Mindful, Headspace, which are all which are just talking about mental health and how you handle those conditions. So that's again an example of consumer side of healthcare technology. Then you also have one of the classic and the biggest businesses in healthcare technology is actually around patient data. So if you go to the hospital or you go to a doctor and you get your annual checkup or something, you want to see your test results and you want to see what your blood pressure was, what your other vitals were. So there are I think at least 1,000+ different applications which are some form or the other of patient engagement, where you can log in and actually see all your healthcare information. So there's a massive amount of applications in just that space alone. So these are some areas of healthcare technology products that very broadly I'm referring to. One of the things that's very different from healthcare technology versus consumer technology is you spend a lot more time building products along edge cases, which is essentially not your core user path, than you do in other industries. So for example, I was at Instacart. Your majority user path is, hey, I get the app, I want to add groceries to my cart, and I want to check out, right? So the majority of the focus as a company at Instacart is on that consumer experience. Now, there are some edge cases where, okay, I live in an area where I can't immediately get the delivery, so now I have to figure out how I'm going to build a product to get that person a delivery. That's an edge case. You don't really, that's not the first order of business when it comes to PMs at Instacart and what they want to solve for. Whereas in healthcare technology, edge cases are basically your that's the meat of your product. Because when you talk about patients, no two patients are alike. Even if you're building an app or a product for a specific, type of patient, even amongst them, you have multiple branches. And so you kind of have to now start taking into account. Typically in classic product management, you always look at, hey, what is my majority user flow and what's the ones which are edge cases? And you kind of are like, let's deprioritize the edge cases one, and we'll do it in a later release. You can't really do that in healthcare. You kind of have to handle all the cases, even in your version 1 of a product. So it's actually a very heavy sort of mindset in terms of product management. And in addition to all those things, there's this other level of, and over the years, I'm still learning. I by no means I'm the be all of all of this knowledge here, but data formats. So in classical healthcare, you have so many data formats of how information is exchanged. So if you go to a particular hospital, for giving a very simple example, you go to a hospital, as soon as you go there and they say, hey, Gaurav Kumar is checked in, there's a certain message that's sent through the back-end systems of healthcare to say Gaurav Kumar is checked in. Now, if you go to another hospital system, that's a completely different data format. So the number one, big challenge that's in healthcare, especially here in the United States, is that no two health systems, no two software systems speak the same language. And hence, if you have to build a product that, let's say, for example, I want to build a product that says, I want to get all my patient records from all the doctors I've ever gone to here in the United States, right? You have to literally build an integration with every single one of those doctor systems. That's the only way to do it. There is no uniform data sharing, and all those formats are different. So that's another aspect of healthcare technology, which is very unique. Whereas if you think about, the non-healthcare space, you have APIs where you can freely, for example, you can just log into Product School, for example, using your Google logins or your LinkedIn or your Facebook, and you have all these APIs and OAuth and all of that can help you just do things very quickly. In healthcare, you do not have that. The other thing that you'll come across is versioning. So even within the same system, so there's a very large healthcare an electronic medical record system called Epic. So Epic is pretty much one of the market leaders here in the United States. The other one is Cerner. Now, if hospital A is on Epic version 9, I'm just throwing out a number there, and hospital B is on Epic version 10, those two versions will most likely not talk to each other. They might have made some changes, and don't quote me on specifically this particular vendor, but one of the challenges, what you're going to see is systems were built very specific to a certain set of standards, and no one went back to do backwards compatibility. So that did not happen at all in healthcare. So there's that versioning challenge. The other thing that I've seen a lot in healthcare technology is, especially in non-consumer applications. So if you're, let's say, a doctor or a nurse or even a patient who's in your typical, let's say UCSF or Sutter Health, large health systems here in the Bay Area, right? You will be using a system where the user experience is not built with the user in mind. A lot of these systems are very old and archaic. They're built on database structures that were designed in the 70s or the 80s, and they've just built products on top of that. So again, a lot of when I say the buttons on the screen reduce engineering complexity, not the user's complexity, what I mean is the system is designed just so that an engineering problem was solved, not necessarily from the perspective of what a user needs to accomplish. And then finally, time to market. With all these things that I've talked about so far, that has led to healthcare in general lagging the rest of the consumer world. But I would say, this is just my take on this, is it's by about 5 years. Just simply because of all these constraints, all this overhead of different formats, versions, all the engineering complexity, all the regulatory complexity, healthcare technology lags the rest of the world by 5 years. Yet it's super exciting. I'm going to pause there very quickly. Any questions on anything I've shared so far?
Yes, we have one question. How do you prioritize between your various users, given there are so many different stakeholders?
Thanks for that question. And I think what I was in the middle of articulating is it really depends on the type of product, the type of users, and what your product is trying to achieve. So I think the example that I was going down the path of giving or sharing was like, let's say you're building an app for a diabetic patient, and if the purpose of the application is purely educational, then of course you need to have valid educational sources. But then in that case, you just prioritize the user experience, right? Because a lot of educational data in healthcare, which is actually another big challenge, is it's all just lots of text. It's very text heavy. You have the likes of WebMD and Healthline and Mayo Clinic that have, you Google search anytime you're feeling unwell and you want to look up a symptom. They do a decent job of like articulating that information, but it's still not, you won't be able to explain that to someone who literally wants to understand something very quickly. So that's how you prioritize the information. Whereas if you're building a diabetic application, which is now also tracking, let's say, the patient's, blood glucose levels, now you have to prioritize the provider side as well. Because, and again, tying back to that thing about healthcare and regulations and compliance, you won't be allowed to even go live with that application unless you had a medical professional who was validating that these blood glucose levels are actually correct. Because what if a patient like actually is going through like a spike in their levels or a dip in their levels, and they enter that information and your application does nothing, then you're in for like a liability. So it all depends on what is the application doing, and that will use and what user problem is it solving for, and that will usually guide which users you prioritize for over the others. And I'd also extend this to just beyond healthcare. In general, always start with the user problem. What's the user? What problem are you trying to solve for that user? And then you will come to identify if there are any other users that need to tie into that application that you need to solve the problem for. So that's how I would look at it. So we had talked about kind of like some of the very unique aspects about healthcare technology, which make product management there very interesting. So I'm just going to now switch over into kind of like talking about how do you get into that as a product manager. So whether you're an aspiring product manager, or you are brand new in the space and you're interested in healthcare technology, or you are not interested in healthcare technology at all, but are like trying to look into it and see what that's all about. What I would say is one of the key things is, speak the language, and you kind of have to like learn the technology. There's so many resources online. If you just type, what are the data formats in a typical healthcare, transaction, you will find so much information there. But, it's one of those things where you kind of have to know some of those basics. And let me tell you this, it's actually it's not super difficult. Especially if it's a product manager role that you're looking at or thinking of. All you need to know is really what are those different elements, and typically you'll be working with an engineering team that will actually help you parse through all the technical aspects of it. So definitely knowing the language of healthcare in terms of when a patient's admitted, how is that data stored, how is that data exchanged between entities, that's some of it. And of course, happy to like get into more details offline as well. One of the other very key things here is just understanding public health and policy. So especially here in the United States, we have a very unique healthcare situation in that healthcare is very fragmented, and the way it's delivered varies hugely from state to state, from region to region, even hospital to hospital, right? So one of the things that'll be super helpful and truly is what actually motivates me as a product manager to actually be in healthcare for all this whole time is to actually look at the body of change that you can impact. And all of that leads back to public health, and how you can solve a problem that is actually a very complex problem here in the United States if you take in the combination of a payer system, a healthcare system, and the patient. So it's actually pretty complicated. One other thing I would also highly recommend is if, of course, some of you may or may not have experienced it firsthand, whether it's like a chronic condition or an acute incident that made you interface with the American healthcare system. Speak to friends, family, anyone you can about their experiences getting healthcare. And one of the things that will again emerge from that is it sounds like it's a very simple problem to solve, right? Like you have let's say you stubbed your toe and you need to like go to urgent care and have it looked at. But that entire encounter is just so complicated. There's so many things, there's so many people you'll speak to, you still at the end of it are like, okay, I don't really know as the patient what's happening. So user empathy is kind of like a really big part of healthcare technology. Like a very simple way of putting it is in other consumer industries, we talk about how many millions of users can I impact, and let's start there. Whereas in healthcare, I think it's kind of it's flipped on its end. I'd say that you actually start with one patient. You're like, how can I change one patient's life, make their experience better? And then how do I now copy paste and kind of like scale that across other patients? Because guess what? Again, there's edge cases and not all patients are the same. So learning from people's experiences about how they have gone through the healthcare system is going to be great. And of course, network within the industry. It's a big part of it. There's again no secret formula about healthcare product management and other product management. I think the one thing that will help you stand out, especially if you're getting into healthcare, is just the general knowledge about how things work in the industry and where things are going. So that would kind of be my message here. I'm going to pause there before I talk about some of these emerging areas, if there are any questions.
There is a question. Somebody missed this, so they wanted you to answer this question again. Why is the time to market so long?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I can spend a long time talking about that. So the time to market is long because if you look at I'm going to try and put this into the framework of non-healthcare versus healthcare. So and again, I'm going to use Instacart as my example here because like that's the one big non-healthcare technology company I've been at. So in Instacart, if you have to release a feature, right, what we typically do is obviously, product works with design to figure out, okay, this is the next new thing we're going to add. We're going to create this screen where you can, say if you want the shopper to like leave your groceries outside your front door. Great, right? So then you user test it very quickly. My user research team will go. It takes them about 2 or 3 days. They get back user feedback. You incorporate that feedback. You hand it to engineering. They build it. You ship it. And you're doing continuous releases throughout all of this, right? So within a span of a week, I could have launched that feature. Now in healthcare technology, let's look at a similar parallel, right? Like if I had to now say, okay, I'm getting a prescription delivered, and I want to say, I want to see if I can actually leave the prescription at the customer's doorstep, or do I need the customer present? Now that changes the equation entirely, because now as a product manager, I have to begin a lot of my work with legal and compliance. So in the state of California, it might be okay to do that, whereas in the state of Georgia, it is not okay to do that. In the state of Utah, you can't even deliver prescriptions, right? So now your entire product is not a single, release of code. Now I have to have a 50-state rule engine, which will say, okay, if this product is being launched in so-and-so state, follow so-and-so rule. And now I have to then look at, okay, are there any local compliance laws that I need to follow? And all that research and all that kind of like work that you do ahead of like even an engineer writing the code takes months. And so that's why time to market is so long. It's just because you have to do all this back and forth with legal and compliance. Because keep in mind, it takes just one adverse incident to kind of like ruin the reputation of your product, ruin the reputation of your company. The fines are heavy from like the government if there's any exposure of patient information. So yeah, I hope that answered the question, but that's just one of the reasons why the time to market is so long.
Okay, what forums would you recommend to network within health tech PM? Any core groups you recommend? And also, like, we have feedback that they're loving this session.
Oh, great. That's a good question. So there's this group called HIMSS, HIMSS. It's kind of like um, I'd say it's the grand old health information management systems. I don't even know what the acronym stands for. And that is one good resource to like just tap into on LinkedIn. They're a group that you can just connect with people. And again, LinkedIn's a great resource. If you see someone, shoot them a message, or if they're connected to a friend of a friend, ask for an introduction. That would be a great place to like actually just learn more. And again, the friends and family network, I keep emphasizing how strong that is. Someone will always know someone's friend's daughter who actually works in a hospital, kind of thing. Definitely tap into that network. It's super helpful to like learn more about that. But just wanted to kind of highlight some of the more, quote unquote, cool areas of healthcare technology that I know of that's coming down the pike. So a lot of this you will see in these consumer facing applications like Noom, that's focused on like, weight loss. I mentioned this previously, but you have Headspace and all these other applications on like, they use this thing called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're using these applications to help change behaviors and drive better outcomes. And it usually is focused a lot on mental health and helping things like anxiety, depression. There's I forget the name of the startup, but there's this I think it's Talkspace maybe, but I could be wrong. But there's this startup where you can actually do a quick therapist session through your phone, which is just so incredible. And I think the mental health space it's exploding. It's a fantastic area to go into, because I think one of the number one things that we don't talk about as a population and as a community is the severity of mental health conditions, even though, physically and physiologically someone could be perfectly okay. Another area which is huge, and actually it's, we are seeing it happen around us with everything going on about COVID-19, the whole population health and community analytics space, to figure out how populations behave and respond to different therapies, to respond to different social dynamics. And you're seeing it right now. Like, for example, of all countries, why was Italy so terribly hit? Well, because culturally, Italians spend a lot of time with their elders. And so what happened was the disease went through asymptomatic younger people, and then unfortunately and tragically infected their seniors. And that's why you're seeing that. So just looking at the dynamics of how population health works is another fascinating area of health tech. The delivery gig economy. I worked with this at Instacart and at a startup before that as well, delivering prescriptions. There's also these models emerging of, like, for example, Lyft and Uber are doing their part by partnering with hospitals and health systems to get patients to appointments. That's a huge deal right there. So that's another area where I'm seeing some traction. And then finally, last but not the least, I had to throw drones in there. It's still an emerging area, but believe it or not, a few months ago, a startup that's backed by Google Ventures, I forget their name, did this pilot in this small town on the East Coast where CVS, a drone picked up a delivery order from a CVS and dropped it off at a customer's location. So kind of fascinating stuff that's going on. Super interesting. But again, some of the things I've covered in this presentation is just mostly around, to get there, to build that great consumer experience, you have all this back story that you need to build in terms of all the challenges you'll face and things to overcome. So it is very exciting, and it's a big passion of mine. So I'm happy to talk more about it beyond just this particular webinar.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gaurav. So I think somebody here wanted to know products in Instacart. I don't know if you have time to talk about it, like specific to health tech, basically. If you can describe that. And
oh yeah, the one and only one that that Instacart has is specifically related to prescription delivery, purely because some of the grocery partners that Instacart works with also have a pharmacy, right? So typically, what's your user experience if you're just walking into the grocery store? You go in, you're there to pick up your prescriptions, and at the same time, you'll buy some bananas, maybe some milk and orange juice, and maybe a pizza, and you'll go back home. So applying that same model to the delivery business is like, okay, you have a prescription, and so do I also want to add those similar items, but instead of me being physically in the store, I'm getting those delivered to my door. So that's kind of pretty much what there is right now at Instacart.